Mark Carter woke up to a frosty winter morning, the kind where the air cuts sharp and crisp, and the snow blankets the ground like an endless quilt of white. His little town of Willowbrook was nestled in a valley, a place where time seemed to move slower. Everybody knew everybody, and while that often felt comforting, it also made privacy a rarity. For Mark, privacy was sacred. A man of few words, he had lived quietly since retiring from his job as a mechanic, spending his days tinkering with old cars in his garage or taking long walks through the woods surrounding the town. That morning started like any other. Mark brewed himself a strong cup of coffee, the aroma filling his small, cozy home. He looked out the window at the snow-covered trees, their branches sagging under the weight. A light smile crept onto his face as he sipped his coffee. He had plans to drive into town to help a friend, Kevin, with his truck, which had been acting up in the cold. Mark had always been the guy people could count on. He wasn't rich or influential, but he was dependable, someone who got things done without asking for much in return. By mid-morning, Mark bundled up in his thick coat and hat, grabbed his gloves, and headed out to his old pickup truck. The engine grumbled to life after a few reluctant attempts, and soon he was on the road, carefully navigating the icy streets. Snow had started falling again, the flakes thick and heavy, creating a curtain that made visibility a challenge. Still, Mark had driven these roads all his life. He knew every curve and pothole by heart. As he neared the edge of town, Mark noticed flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. A sinking feeling settled in his gut as the police cruiser closed the distance behind him. Mark glanced at his speedometer, he was well within the limit. Confused but compliant, he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. The cruiser stopped behind him, and two officers emerged, their uniforms crisp against the backdrop of falling snow. Officer Bradley, tall and broad-shouldered with a perpetual scowl, approached Mark's window. His partner, Officer Harris, hung back, leaning casually against the cruiser with a smirk that suggested he found the situation amusing. "License and registration," Bradley barked, his tone sharp enough to cut through the cold air. Mark reached into his glove compartment and handed over the requested documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with unease. Bradley ignored the question, scrutinizing Mark's license as if it were a counterfeit bill. After a moment, he glanced up. "You rolled through that stop sign back there." Mark frowned. He was certain he hadn't, but he knew better than to argue. "I'm sorry if it seemed that way," he said diplomatically. "I'll be more careful." Bradley's scowl deepened. "Seemed that way? You calling me a liar, Mr. Carter?" Mark shook his head quickly. "No, sir. Just saying I didn't notice if I did." Bradley stepped back, gesturing for Mark to exit the vehicle. "Step out of the truck." Mark hesitated, confusion giving way to a flicker of indignation. "Is that really necessary? I'm cooperating." "Step out of the truck," Bradley repeated, his tone leaving no room for debate. With a sigh, Mark unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out into the biting cold. The snow crunched under his boots as he stood facing the officers. Bradley circled him like a predator assessing its prey, while Harris chuckled softly from the sidelines. "What's in the truck bed?" Bradley demanded. "Tools," Mark replied. "I'm heading into town to help a friend fix his truck." Bradley nodded toward Harris, who sauntered over and began rummaging through Mark's belongings without permission. Mark clenched his jaw, a flush of anger warming his face despite the freezing temperature. He knew this wasn't right, but what could he do? Speak up, and risk escalating the situation? As Harris poked around, Bradley turned his attention back to Mark. "You ever been in trouble with the law, Carter?" "No, sir," Mark said firmly. "Never." Bradley's eyes narrowed, as though searching for cracks in Mark's story. "We'll see about that." Harris returned, shrugging. Nothing interesting back there. Just tools and a spare tire. Bradley grunted, then looked Mark up and down. You seem like a guy who thinks he's above the rules. You're not. You need a reminder. Mark's stomach sank. A reminder, he echoed. Bradley's lips curled into a cruel smile. Drop and give me 20. Mark blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Excuse me? You heard me. 20 push-ups. Right here, right now. The absurdity of the demand stunned Mark into silence. His breath puffed visibly in the icy air as he stared at the officer. You can't be serious. Bradley stepped closer, towering over him. You questioning my authority, Carter? Because I can make this a lot worse for you. Mark looked between the two officers. Harris was grinning openly now, his breath fogging as he laughed. Better do what he says, Harris drawled. Unless you want to spend the night in a holding cell. The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Mark's mind raced. He could refuse, but he knew that would only lead to more trouble. Swallowing his pride, he dropped to his hands and knees. The cold was immediate and unforgiving, seeping through his gloves and jeans as he began the humiliating task. 1, 2, he counted under his breath, each push-up a struggle against both the biting cold and his own indignation. By the time he reached 20, his arms burned, and his breath came in labored puffs. Good boy, Bradley sneered, clapping his hands mockingly. Now get back in your truck and stay out of trouble. Mark rose slowly, brushing snow from his gloves and knees. He climbed back into his truck without a word, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he watched the officers return to their cruiser. His heart pounded with a mix of anger, humiliation, and a growing resolve. They thought they could treat him like this and get away with it. They thought wrong. As Mark drove away, the snow swirling around his truck like a cocoon, he knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. What those officers didn't know, and would soon regret, was that Mark Carter was not a man to be underestimated. Mark drove away from the scene, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The humiliation he felt burned hotter than the cold air outside. The icy roads blurred under the soft snowfall as his thoughts raced. He couldn't stop replaying the incident in his mind, the sneering face of Officer Bradley, the mocking laughter of Officer Harris, and the frigid snow biting into his palms as he performed the demeaning push-ups. It wasn't just the physical discomfort that lingered, it was the sheer degradation of the moment. Mark wasn't a prideful man, but today, they'd crossed a line. By the time he reached Kevin's garage, Mark was still simmering with anger. Kevin, a stout man with grease-streaked hands and a perpetual smile, was waiting by the open bay door. As Mark stepped out of his truck, Kevin's grin faltered. Hey, man, what happened? You look like you've been through hell, Kevin said, his voice tinged with concern. Mark shook his head, trying to steady himself. Ran into some trouble with the cops on the way here. Kevin's brows furrowed. Trouble? What kind of trouble? Mark hesitated, but then the dam broke. He recounted everything, the stop, the accusations, and the humiliating punishment. Kevin listened in stunned silence, his mouth tightening with each detail. They made you do push-ups? In the snow? What kind of power trip is that? Kevin said, his voice rising with indignation. Mark shrugged. They wanted to make a point. And they did. But I'm not letting this go, Kevin. Not this time. Kevin nodded, his expression hardening. Good. You shouldn't. Those guys think they're untouchable, but they're not. Mark spent the rest of the afternoon helping Kevin with his truck, though his mind wasn't fully on the task. The image of Bradley's smug face kept intruding, fueling his resolve. When he finally headed home, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a pale orange glow over the snow-covered town. That evening, Mark sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. In front of him lay a notepad, and he was jotting down everything he could remember about the incident. The time, the location, the exact words spoken, it all went down in black ink. His military training had taught him the importance of details, and he wasn't about to let any slip through the cracks. Mark wasn't naive. He knew filing a complaint wouldn't be enough. In a small town like Willowbrook, the police were often treated like untouchable figures of authority. People rarely questioned them, let alone held them accountable. But Mark also knew he couldn't do this alone. The next morning, he reached out to Eleanor Bennett, a retired judge who had moved to Willowbrook a few years ago. Eleanor was known for her sharp mind and her no-nonsense approach to justice. She had a reputation for standing up against injustice, even in her retirement. Eleanor answered the door of her modest home, her silver hair neatly pinned back, and her piercing blue eyes scanning Mark with curiosity. "Mark Carter," she said with a warm yet wary smile. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Mark explained everything, his voice steady but tinged with the frustration that had been building since the previous day. Eleanor listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "What they did to you is not just humiliating, it's a gross abuse of power. But I'm sure you already know that." Mark nodded. "I do. I just don't know what to do about it. Complaints get buried in this town." Eleanor's eyes sparkled with determination. "Then we don't let it get buried. We gather evidence, we make noise, and we hold them accountable." Mark felt a flicker of hope. "How do we start?" Eleanor tapped her fingers on the armrest of her chair. "First, we need corroboration. Did anyone else witness what happened?" Mark thought back to the incident. He remembered a couple of cars slowing down as they passed and a man standing on the sidewalk with his phone out. "There was someone," he said slowly. "A guy with a phone. I think he might have been recording." Eleanor's lips curved into a small smile. "Then we find him. That video could be the key to everything." The two of them set out to track down the bystander. It didn't take long, word traveled fast in Willowbrook. By midday, they had a name, Jason Miller, a college student home for the holidays. Jason was more than willing to help. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," Jason said when they met at a local coffee shop. "I recorded the whole thing, but I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't want to get in trouble." Mark reassured him. "You're not in trouble. You're helping expose something that needs to be seen." Jason handed over the video, and Eleanor reviewed it with a critical eye. The footage was clear and damning. It showed Mark being forced to do push-ups in the snow while the officers stood over him, laughing and taunting. "This," Eleanor said, holding up the phone, "is our smoking gun." Armed with the video, Mark and Eleanor took the evidence to the mayor's office. Mayor Harold Dawson, a man known for his pragmatic approach to town politics, watched the footage in silence. When it ended, he let out a heavy sigh and rubbed his temples. "This is bad," Dawson said, his voice low. "It's more than bad," Eleanor replied. "It's a blatant abuse of power. And it's your responsibility to address it." Dawson looked at Mark, his eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. "You're putting me in a difficult position, Carter." Mark's voice was steady as he replied. "I'm not the one who put you here, Mayor. Those officers did." The mayor promised to launch an internal investigation, but Mark wasn't content to leave it at that. With Eleanor's encouragement, he took the story to the local press. Within days, the video was making waves far beyond Willowbrook. The town was abuzz with debate. Some people were outraged by the officers' behavior, while others defended them, claiming the video didn't show the whole story. Mark found himself thrust into the spotlight, a position he'd never wanted but now had no choice but to embrace. Through it all, he remained focused. This wasn't just about him, it was about standing up to a system that allowed such abuses to go unchecked. And as the days passed, Mark's quiet resolve began to inspire others. People started coming forward with their own stories of mistreatment by the police, and the tide slowly began to turn. But Mark knew this was only the beginning. He wasn't fighting just for justice for himself, he was fighting for something much bigger. And he wasn't going to back down. The story exploded beyond anything Mark could have anticipated. By the time the weekend rolled around, the local news coverage had escalated into a full-blown media frenzy. The video of the incident had gone viral on social media, amassing millions of views within days. National outlets began picking up the story, framing it as a shocking example of police misconduct in small-town America. Mark's phone buzzed incessantly with calls, texts, and emails. Friends and strangers alike were reaching out, offering support or sharing their own tales of injustice. Despite the chaos swirling around him, Mark remained calm and focused. He had spent years in the military, enduring situations far more intense than this media circus. But the stakes here felt deeply personal. This wasn't a mission assigned by a superior officer, this was his fight, his chance to stand up for something that truly mattered. The pressure on the Willowbrook Police Department grew by the hour. Chief Richard Harlow, a man who had long enjoyed a reputation for running a tight ship, found himself in the crosshairs. At first, Harlow tried to downplay the situation, issuing a statement that the video lacked full context, and that the officers involved had acted within their discretion. But as more details emerged, his stance became increasingly untenable. Other residents of Willowbrook started coming forward with their own experiences of mistreatment at the hands of officers Bradley and Harris. An elderly man recounted how he'd been threatened with a citation for jaywalking after questioning the officer's behavior during a traffic stop. A young mother tearfully shared how she'd been berated in front of her children for parking too close to a fire hydrant, even though the hydrant was barely visible under a mound of snow. These stories painted a damning picture of a culture of arrogance and impunity within the department. Eleanor Bennett played a pivotal role in coordinating these testimonies. Her experience as a judge proved invaluable as she helped residents draft formal complaints and organize their accounts into compelling narratives. This isn't just about one incident, she told Mark during one of their late-night strategy sessions. This is about a pattern of abuse. If we can prove that, we'll have a much stronger case. Mark nodded, his jaw set in determination. I'm not stopping until they're held accountable. Every last one of them. Meanwhile, Officer Bradley and Officer Harris were feeling the heat. Their names had been leaked to the press, and they quickly became the targets of public outrage. Protesters gathered outside the police station, demanding their suspension and a thorough investigation. Bradley, the more vocal of the two, tried to defend himself in an interview with a local news station. The guy was out of line, Bradley said, his tone defensive. We were just trying to teach him a lesson, keep him out of trouble. It wasn't personal. But the public wasn't buying it. The video told a different story, one of cruelty and unchecked authority. Social media lit up with calls for Bradley and Harris to resign, and hashtags like #JusticeForMark and #PushUpAbuse began trending nationwide. As the public pressure mounted, Mayor Dawson convened an emergency town hall meeting to address the growing crisis. The town hall was held in the high school gymnasium, and it was packed to capacity. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in anger and frustration as they demanded answers. Mark sat near the front, flanked by Eleanor and Jason, the college student whose video had sparked the movement. When it was his turn to speak, Mark rose to his feet and walked to the microphone. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. I've lived in this town my whole life, Mark began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I've served my country, and I've always believed in standing up for what's right. What happened to me last week wasn't right. It wasn't just. And it wasn't the first time these officers have abused their power. He paused, letting his words sink in. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about holding the people who are supposed to protect us accountable when they fail to do their jobs. And it's about making sure this never happens to anyone else. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing off the gymnasium walls. For the first time, Mark felt the full weight of the community's support. He wasn't in this fight alone. The next day, Chief Harlow announced that Officers Bradley and Harris had been placed on administrative leave pending an independent investigation. It was a small victory, but Mark knew it was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, Eleanor worked tirelessly to compile a case against the officers. She enlisted the help of a local attorney, Sarah Nguyen, who specialized in civil rights law. Together, they began preparing a lawsuit that would target not only Bradley and Harris but also the systemic issues within the Willowbrook Police Department. As the investigation unfolded, more damning evidence came to light. Body camera footage revealed that Bradley and Harris had a history of bending the rules to suit their own purposes. In one instance, they had falsely accused a teenager of shoplifting simply because he had mouthed off to them. In another, they had confiscated a homeless man's belongings without cause, leaving him to fend for himself in freezing temperatures. The revelations sent shockwaves through the community. Many residents who had previously defended the officers now found themselves questioning their loyalty. The local newspaper published a scathing editorial titled, "A Culture of Corruption," calling for sweeping reforms within the police department. Mark, meanwhile, found himself becoming an unlikely hero. People stopped him on the street to thank him for speaking out. Local businesses offered to cover his legal fees or provide other forms of support. For a man who had always preferred to stay out of the spotlight, it was a surreal experience. But Mark remained focused on the bigger picture. "This isn't about me being a hero," he told a reporter during an interview. "It's about fixing what's broken in our system. If I have to be the face of that fight, so be it." As winter wore on, the case against Bradley and Harris gained momentum. The independent investigation uncovered a litany of misconduct, leading to their official termination from the police force. Chief Harlow also stepped down, citing personal reasons, though many suspected he had been forced out. The fallout didn't stop there. The town council launched a comprehensive review of the police department, implementing new policies to increase transparency and accountability. Eleanor and Sarah pushed for a civilian oversight board to monitor police activity, a proposal that gained widespread support. For Mark, the journey had been long and arduous, but it was far from over. The lawsuit was still pending, and there were many battles left to fight. But as he stood in the center of his snowy backyard one evening, gazing up at the stars, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in weeks. The humiliation he had endured that day in the snow had been transformed into something powerful, something meaningful. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt hopeful about the future, not just for himself, but for his town. As spring crept into Willowbrook, melting away the last remnants of winter, the town found itself irrevocably transformed. The fallout from the scandal involving officers Bradley and Harris had created ripples that extended far beyond Mark's initial ordeal. It was a time of reckoning, not just for the Willowbrook Police Department, but for the entire community. Mark, despite his aversion to being in the limelight, became an undeniable symbol of resilience and accountability. Yet, as much as he had garnered support, there were still forces working against him. In the weeks following the termination of Bradley and Harris, the Willowbrook Police Union launched a counter-campaign to paint the officers as victims of public hysteria. Flyers appeared on community bulletin boards and in mailboxes, bearing bold headlines like, "Defend Our Heroes," and "Don't Let Mob Justice Destroy Lives." They portrayed Bradley and Harris as hard-working officers whose reputations had been unfairly tarnished. Some residents, particularly those who had long viewed law enforcement as above reproach, began questioning whether the punishment had been too harsh. Mark watched all this unfold with a mixture of frustration and determination. "They're trying to rewrite the narrative," Eleanor said during one of their strategy meetings. "They want to shift the focus away from the systemic issues and make this about sympathy for the officers." Mark nodded, his expression grim. "We can't let that happen. People need to remember what this is really about: justice, accountability, and making sure this kind of abuse doesn't happen again." To counter the police union's efforts, Mark and his growing circle of allies began organizing community events to keep the momentum going. The first was a town hall forum held at the local community center, where residents were invited to share their stories of interactions with law enforcement. The turnout was overwhelming. One by one, people stepped up to the microphone to recount their experiences. A small business owner talked about being threatened with unnecessary fines after questioning a parking ticket. A teenager spoke nervously about being followed home by a patrol car for no apparent reason. A middle-aged black man described how he'd been stopped and frisked while jogging in his own neighborhood. As the stories piled up, a clear picture emerged. The problems within the Willowbrook Police Department were not isolated incidents but part of a broader culture of unchecked authority and bias. The forum ended with a standing ovation for Mark, Eleanor, and Sarah, whose work had sparked this movement. But not everyone was on board with the changes sweeping through Willowbrook. A small but vocal group of residents, many of whom had long-standing ties to the police department, began pushing back. They attended council meetings in droves, loudly opposing reforms like the proposed Civilian Oversight Board and mandatory body cameras for officers. Some even targeted Mark directly, leaving threatening notes in his mailbox or making anonymous phone calls late at night. Mark took these threats in stride, refusing to let fear deter him. "They want me to back down," he told Eleanor one evening as they reviewed paperwork for the upcoming lawsuit. "But they don't realize I've been through worse. This isn't going to break me." Eleanor smiled, her admiration for Mark evident. "You're tougher than they give you credit for. But don't forget, you're not in this alone. We've got your back." The lawsuit against the Willowbrook Police Department officially went to court in early May. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and community members eager to see justice served. Sarah Nguyen, with her razor-sharp legal mind and commanding presence, presented a compelling case. She called a series of witnesses to testify about their experiences with Bradley, Harris, and the broader culture of the department. Among the witnesses was Jason, the college student who had filmed the infamous video. He described the scene in vivid detail, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I didn't know what would happen when I started recording," he admitted. "But I knew it wasn't right. No one should be treated that way, especially by the people who are supposed to protect us." The defense, representing the police department, attempted to discredit the witnesses and downplay the officers' actions. They argued that Mark had been uncooperative during the initial encounter and that the push-ups were intended as a constructive alternative to a formal citation. But their arguments fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence, including the body camera footage and testimonies from other officers who had grown disillusioned with the department's leadership. As the trial progressed, Mark found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed since that fateful winter morning. He thought about the boyhood version of himself who had idolized police officers, seeing them as heroes who could do no wrong. That idealism had been shattered, but in its place, Mark had found a deeper understanding of justice, a justice that required accountability, fairness, and compassion. The trial culminated in a dramatic closing argument from Sarah, who implored the jury to consider not just the harm done to Mark but the broader implications of allowing such behavior to go unchecked. "This case isn't just about one man," she said, her voice resonating with conviction. "It's about every person in this community who has been mistreated, dismissed, or silenced. It's about standing up to abuse of power and saying, enough is enough." The jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching a verdict. When the foreman announced their decision, guilty of misconduct and negligence on the part of the officers and the department, the courtroom erupted in applause. Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he knew this was just one step in a much larger journey. The court awarded Mark a substantial settlement, but he chose to donate a significant portion of it to initiatives aimed at improving police-community relations in Willowbrook. These funds went toward training programs, youth mentorship initiatives, and resources for marginalized communities. In the weeks that followed, the Civilian Oversight Board was officially established, and a new police chief was appointed, one who vowed to rebuild trust and transparency within the department. While some residents remained skeptical, many were cautiously optimistic that real change was finally taking root. For Mark, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though he knew he would always be seen as the man who stood up to corruption in Willowbrook. Strangers still stopped him in the grocery store or on the street to thank him, their gratitude a constant reminder of the impact he had made. One evening, as Mark sat on his porch watching the sunset, he received a call from Jason. The young man had recently graduated and was heading to law school, inspired in part by his involvement in the case. "I just wanted to say thanks," Jason said. "For standing up when it mattered. You changed my life, and I'm going to do my best to pay it forward." Mark smiled, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. "You're going to do great things, Jason. Just remember, it's not about being perfect, it's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." As he hung up the phone, Mark took a deep breath, the cool spring air filling his lungs. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Willowbrook was changing, and so was he. Together, they were proving that even in the face of adversity, ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. The summer that followed the trial marked a turning point for both Mark and Willowbrook. The town, once complacent in its reliance on tradition and authority, now found itself grappling with the complexities of reform and accountability. For Mark, life was anything but quiet. Though he longed for the solitude of his carpentry workshop, his role as a community advocate had become inescapable. He was no longer just a man who stood up to police misconduct, he was a symbol of change, a beacon for those who had lost faith in the system. As the newly formed Civilian Oversight Board began its work, tensions flared between reformists and traditionalists in Willowbrook. Town hall meetings became battlegrounds where heated debates unfolded. On one side were those pushing for transparency and fairness, while on the other were individuals clinging to the belief that authority should never be questioned. Mark often found himself at the center of these discussions, his presence alone enough to ignite passionate arguments. One particularly contentious meeting took place on a sweltering July evening. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation and resentment. The board was set to discuss new policies for officer accountability, including stricter guidelines for use of force and mandatory cultural sensitivity training. As Mark listened to the arguments, he couldn't help but notice the divide among the attendees. Older residents who had grown up trusting the police sat with their arms crossed, their expressions wary. Meanwhile, younger people and marginalized community members leaned forward, eager to see change. Midway through the meeting, a man named Harold, a retired police officer, stood up to speak. Harold was a towering figure in the community, known for his decades of service and unwavering support for law enforcement. His voice boomed as he addressed the board. "I've served this town for over 30 years, he began, his tone heavy with authority. "And I can tell you one thing, you don't fix problems by tearing down the people who protect you." What happened to Mark was unfortunate, but let's not forget that our officers put their lives on the line every day. The room erupted in applause from one side and murmurs of dissent from the other. Mark felt a surge of frustration but held his tongue. When the floor opened for public comment, he took a deep breath and stood, the weight of everyone's eyes pressing on him. "Harold," he began, his voice steady but firm, "I respect your years of service, and I understand the sacrifices officers make. But protecting a community doesn't mean having free rein to abuse power. It means holding yourself to a higher standard, because trust is earned, not demanded." The room fell silent as Mark continued. What happened to me wasn't just unfortunate. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that affects everyone in this town. If we want a safer Willowbrook, we have to be willing to have these hard conversations and make meaningful changes. Otherwise, we're just putting a band-aid on a wound that keeps getting worse. By the time he finished, the room was buzzing with mixed reactions. Some nodded in agreement, while others whispered among themselves, their skepticism evident. Harold, though clearly displeased, offered a grudging nod of acknowledgement before sitting down. As the meeting concluded, Mark stepped outside to catch his breath. The summer air was heavy with humidity, and fireflies flickered in the twilight. Eleanor found him leaning against a lamppost, his face a mask of exhaustion. "You did good in there," she said, handing him a bottle of water. Mark chuckled dryly. "Feels like I'm talking to a brick wall half the time. But thanks." Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Change is slow, Mark. People resist what they don't understand. But you're planting seeds, whether you realize it or not." Despite the challenges, progress was being made. The Oversight Board began implementing new policies, and the police department underwent a series of reforms. A younger, forward-thinking police chief named Mia Caldwell was appointed, bringing a fresh perspective to the force. Chief Caldwell reached out to Mark directly, inviting him to participate in discussions about community policing. Though skeptical at first, Mark agreed, recognizing the importance of collaboration. During one of these meetings, Mark shared his vision for a more compassionate and inclusive approach to law enforcement. "It's not about being soft on crime," he explained. "It's about understanding the people you're protecting and working with them, not against them. When officers see themselves as part of the community instead of separate from it, everyone benefits." Chief Caldwell nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, Mark. We've got a long road ahead, but I think we're heading in the right direction." As summer turned to fall, Mark began to see the fruits of his labor. The community started hosting events aimed at bridging the gap between residents and law enforcement. One such event was a Coffee with a Cop Day, where officers and residents could sit down and have honest, unfiltered conversations. Mark attended reluctantly, unsure of how he would be received. To his surprise, several officers approached him, expressing their desire to learn from past mistakes and build a better relationship with the community. One officer, a young woman named Officer Ramirez, shared her thoughts. "I joined the force because I wanted to help people," she said. "But after everything that's happened, I realized I need to do more listening and less assuming. I just wanted to thank you for opening my eyes to that." Mark felt a flicker of hope. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong," he replied. "But that's where real growth starts. Keep listening, and you'll make a difference." Meanwhile, Mark's personal life began to stabilize. His workshop, which had been neglected during the whirlwind of activism, became his sanctuary once more. Orders for his handcrafted furniture started pouring in, many from people who admired his courage and wanted to support him. Mark found solace in the rhythmic act of sanding, carving, and assembling, each piece a tangible reminder of his resilience. But even as things seemed to settle, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his work was far from over. One evening, he received a letter from a woman named Linda in a neighboring town. Linda's son, a high school senior, had been wrongfully arrested and humiliated by local officers. The incident had left him traumatized and fearful of authority. "I heard about what you did in Willowbrook," Linda wrote. "I don't know where else to turn. Can you help us?" Mark read the letter several times, his heart heavy with the weight of the request. He knew firsthand how difficult it was to confront systemic injustice, but he also knew the importance of standing up for what was right. After discussing it with Eleanor and Sarah, he decided to meet with Linda and her son, offering them both his support and the resources they needed to fight their case. As he drove to the meeting, Mark reflected on how much he had changed since that freezing winter morning when two officers had tried to strip him of his dignity. Back then, he was just a man trying to make it through another day. Now, he was a force for change, someone who had found his voice in the face of adversity. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but Mark was ready. He had learned that true strength came not from physical might but from the courage to stand up, speak out, and fight for justice. And as he pulled into Linda's driveway, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Mark's meeting with Linda and her son, Jamal, turned out to be one of the most emotionally charged moments of his journey. As they sat together in Linda's modest living room, she recounted the harrowing story of how Jamal was detained on his way home from basketball practice. The officers had accused him of fitting the description of a suspect in a robbery, ignoring his repeated protests of innocence. When Jamal hesitated to answer one of their questions out of fear, one of the officers forced him to the ground, handcuffed him, and called him disrespectful. It wasn't just about the arrest, Linda said, her voice trembling. It was how they looked at him, how they treated him like he wasn't even human. "My son is not a criminal, Mr. Henderson. He's a straight-A student. He works part-time to save for college. He's never even had detention, let alone been in trouble with the law." Jamal, seated quietly beside his mother, finally spoke up. His voice was soft but resolute. "It's like they didn't see me as a person. Just a threat. I can't even walk through my own neighborhood without feeling like I'm being watched. How am I supposed to live like this?" Mark listened intently, his heart aching for the young man. He saw so much of his younger self in Jamal, full of potential but weighed down by a system that refused to see his worth. After hearing their story, Mark promised to help. He connected them with a lawyer he had worked with during his own case and began strategizing ways to bring attention to Jamal's plight. Over the following weeks, Mark threw himself into the fight for Jamal's justice. He leveraged the connections he had made in Willowbrook, reaching out to journalists, activists, and community leaders. Slowly but surely, Jamal's story began to gain traction. Local news outlets picked it up, framing it as yet another example of systemic injustice. Mark and Jamal even appeared on a regional talk show to discuss the incident, their calm and articulate demeanor winning over many viewers. But not everyone was on their side. Just as Mark had faced resistance in Willowbrook, he found himself battling a wave of backlash from those who believed the officers had acted appropriately. Social media lit up with debates, some praising Mark and Jamal for their bravery, others accusing them of stirring unnecessary conflict. Mark's email inbox filled with messages, some supportive, others outright hateful. One evening, Mark sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through the vitriol online. "Maybe I'm pushing too hard," he said to Eleanor, who was busy preparing tea. "Every time I try to help someone, it feels like I'm opening myself up to more attacks." Eleanor placed a steaming cup in front of him and sat down. "You're not pushing too hard, Mark. You're doing what's right. Change isn't easy, and it's never without opposition. But you've already shown this town, and this region, what's possible. Don't let the noise drown out the impact you're making." Her words reignited his resolve. Mark knew he couldn't afford to back down, not for Jamal, not for Linda, and not for the countless others who had experienced similar injustices. He pressed on, organizing a peaceful rally outside the local police department to demand accountability and fair treatment for Jamal. Hundreds of people showed up, holding signs that read, "Justice for Jamal," and "Enough is enough." Mark spoke passionately about the need for systemic change, his words resonating with the diverse crowd. As the rally gained momentum, a surprising figure emerged from the building, Chief Mia Caldwell, the newly appointed police chief from Willowbrook. She had heard about the rally and decided to attend in solidarity. Taking the microphone, she addressed the crowd. "I want to acknowledge the pain and frustration that incidents like Jamal's cause," she began, her voice steady. Accountability starts with leadership, and I'm here to listen and learn. The past doesn't have to define our future. Together, we can build a better relationship between law enforcement and the communities we serve. Her unexpected appearance was a turning point. While some remained skeptical, others saw it as a glimmer of hope. For Jamal, it was the first time he felt like someone in authority genuinely cared about his experience. The momentum from the rally carried over into tangible action. The police department agreed to review Jamal's case, and the officers involved were placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. Meanwhile, Mark and Linda worked tirelessly to keep the pressure on, ensuring that the issue wouldn't be swept under the rug. But amidst the progress, an unexpected twist shook Mark to his core. Late one night, he received an anonymous letter slid under his front door. It was written in blocky, uneven handwriting and contained a shocking confession. One of the officers involved in Jamal's arrest had been coerced by his superior to file a false report to justify their actions. The letter included details only someone within the department could know, along with a plea for Mark to expose the truth. Mark was stunned. The letter confirmed what many had suspected but couldn't prove. He debated what to do, knowing the risks involved in bringing such information to light. If the letter was legitimate, it could blow the case wide open. But if it was a trap, it could discredit everything he and Jamal had worked for. After consulting with the lawyer and Chief Caldwell, Mark decided to take the letter to the district attorney's office. The DA, initially skeptical, launched a quiet inquiry into the matter. Within weeks, the investigation uncovered a pattern of misconduct within the department, including falsified reports and misuse of authority. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community and led to the suspension of several high-ranking officers. For Jamal and Linda, the truth brought a sense of vindication. While the road to justice was far from over, they finally felt seen and heard. For Mark, it was a bittersweet victory. The fight had taken a toll on him, but it had also reaffirmed his belief in the power of persistence and courage. As the dust settled, Mark reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. What had started as a humiliating encounter on a freezing winter day had grown into a movement that touched countless lives. He had faced obstacles, endured criticism, and made sacrifices, but he had also witnessed the transformative power of resilience and unity. The following spring, Mark stood on the steps of the courthouse, addressing a crowd gathered to celebrate the passage of a new community oversight law inspired by his advocacy. "This isn't just my story," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's our story. It's about what we can achieve, and we stand together and refuse to accept the status quo. Change isn't easy, but it's always worth it." The crowd erupted in applause, a testament to the impact he had made. As Mark looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, black and white, united by a shared vision for justice, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace.